Morning. Even as little as 60 years ago, most adults in the U.S. affiliated with some Christian denomination, according to a poll I had seen. Many people had at least a passing familiarity with the Bible. Christianity was so pervasive in the culture that in my youth here in Missouri, state law forbid certain things from being sold on Sunday, and most retail stores were actually closed on Sunday. And there's a vestige of that even today. You can't buy an automobile on Sunday from an automobile dealer. The dealers are closed by state law. And although they say they would like a day off, I'm sure that that's probably a vestige of the blue laws. So even the cultural expectation is that if a Christian attends a church, that they are going to do so in the hours of Sunday morning. Today our society is trending towards being secular and away from being Christian. Even so, as we interact with others, it's normal for them to expect that if you say you're a Christian, that you're going to attend church on Sunday morning, and they will think it very odd that you would spend 24 hours observing anything. This is also serves as a stone of stumbling as we preach the true gospel, because the big churches can't be wrong in what they're doing in their doctrinal practices. So I hope every adult here has studied why the Sabbath day, why the seventh-day Sabbath day is an important aspect of your personal relationship with God, and why the Sabbath is the first of the several holy days depicting God's plan of salvation. Thus, it's a topic for home education for every child in the Church of God. But conventional Christianity considers that Sunday is the Lord's day, and they should have church on that day. It's important to be at least familiar why they do that, just as important as it is to understand the background of Christmas and Easter. And believe it or not, observing Easter is directly tied to the observance of Sunday. The title of my sermonette is, Why Did Sunday Replace the Sabbath? Why did Sunday replace the Sabbath? In 1969, a minister of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Samuele Bacchiocchi, applied to study at the highest university in the Catholic faith, the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. He wanted to earn a doctorate in church history, specializing in the question of how did the Sabbath get changed to Sunday. And so that this particular university, of all the universities in the world, would give him access to the most complete research materials on this subject, because the Roman Church was the source of this teaching. So at the time of his admission, he was the only non-Catholic to have ever been admitted to Pope Gregorian. The university was not just any other school. It was the university founded by Ignatius, who was also the founder of the Society of Jesus, who are commonly called Jesuits. Many people who later became bishops and cardinals and even popes had attended Pope Gregorian. It was very prestigious. It was the most prestigious of all of the Roman Church organizations' universities. Attending there gave Bacchiocchi access to the vast resources of the archives and the library, and thus to documents hidden from any outsider. Some of the documents that he accessed had not been reviewed by anyone for centuries. As he was studying the history of the early church, he began to clearly define the topic, the details of his doctoral thesis. That was to be a historical investigation of the rise of Sunday observance in early Christianity. That would later be the exact subtitle of his thesis when he published it. The historical investigation of the rise of Sunday observance in early Christianity. I had recently spoken about the importance of the fidelity to the body of beliefs that Jesus conveyed first to the 12 disciples and later to the very first converts, sometimes quite dramatically, as it's recorded in Acts and the Gospels. This is succinctly expressed as I quoted in Jude verse 3, Dear friends, although I have been eager to write to you about our common salvation, I feel now compelled instead to write to encourage you to contend earnestly for the faith that was once for all entrusted to the saints. The very phraseology, once for all entrusted, Jude reminds us that even minor doctrines are not to be changed, let alone a major one like the Sabbath. And as I said before, it's important to know what you believe and why you believe it. It's also useful to know why others have rejected what you know to be true and why they have adopted something else. Because this is part of the social dynamic, it's part of the social considerations that we have in doing the primary thing that God called us to do, which is to preach the gospel. When the idea for his doctrinal research had been sufficiently developed, he went to his advisor to get permission to carry the research to maturity as a doctoral thesis. The initial answer was no, because this advisor, coincidentally, had just a few years earlier been the advisor to the doctoral student C.S. Mazza, who researched the very same topic. The reason to decline permission was that the university had a tradition that once a topic had been researched thoroughly and was considered so well done as to fully address the subject, no student should be permitted to open that subject again. But Dr. Bacchiocchi had come to the meeting fully prepared because he had read Mazza's thesis. He had found historical documents that Mazza had failed to discover, or at least had not discussed or considered in the thesis. Upon that basis, his advisor gave his approval. One of the documents that Bacchiocchi found was a work written in about 370 AD by Epiphanius, who was the bishop in the island of Cyprus. In volume 29 of this work, he condemned a sect he called Nazarenes because they were different from Jews and Christians. One reason was that they were still, in his words, fettered by the law. They were sort of Christians, but they were fettered by the law, including the Sabbath. This group had the hallmark of being the descendants of the Jerusalem church some 340 years prior. Bacchiocchi showed that part of this dynamic from the change from Sabbath to Sunday was that in early 100 ADs, during the reign of Emperor Hadrian, the Bishop of Rome had in fact changed the observing of Sunday to the observing Sunday as a result of at least two major factors. One was a growing sense of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism, and a desire to reject all things that were Jewish. The first is really, in my opinion, tainted by anti-Semitism. And the second one is a return to pagan sun worship that Rome had once practiced, and that they began to renew their veneration of the day of the sun. In 135 AD, Hadrian issued some repressive anti-Jewish legislation. As Bacchiocchi puts it, to avoid the repressive anti-Sabbath Roman legislation, many Gentile Christians followed the lead of the Bishop of Rome and changed from Sabbath to Sunday. Thus, the motive in this case was expediency rather than as a result of a newly discovered divine command. Historical evidence also shows that sun worship had then become popular in Rome in the early part of the 2nd century. So the change from observing from a divine commanded Sabbath rest to what was observed now on Sunday also changed the meaning, the authority, and the experience of the weekly day being observed. While the Sabbath pictures a rest based on God's authority and pictures the creation, the finishing of God's work, and the end point of His creation, Sunday does no such thing. It is claimed to be the picture of the day of the resurrection of Jesus. But of course, as we know, a careful reading of Scripture plainly shows now that the resurrection was not on Sunday morning. In addition, in 325 AD, the Roman Church colluded with Emperor Constantine to adopt Christianity as the religion of his empire. The church became closely aligned with the empire. Lately, any person who violated church teachings would also become an enemy of the state, subject to personal criminal prosecution, maybe having their homes seized, and maybe even put to death. Here's how Rick Chamberlain put it in his article, Anti-Judaism and the Council of Nicaea. And when I read these two paragraphs, you can hear and see hints of early New Testament church in it. And this was on an article that was quite lengthy, and it was from the standpoint of a Jew reflecting upon the changes in the Christian church. So he says, Passover was still celebrated by Gentile Christian church, but the Gentiles began to see the need to differentiate their Passover from the Jewish Passover. The bishop decided to move the Christian celebration of Passover to the first Sunday of the Jewish after the Jewish Passover in most years. The Jewish Passover always fell on the 14th of Nisan, which can fall on any day of this week. Centuries later, the very name for Passover, or Pesach, also became distasteful to the Gentile church, and terms such as Easter, quote, parenthesis, the name of a pagan goddess, parenthesis, were adopted by the increasingly paganized church. The first edict in favor of the venerable Day of the Sun was made at the Council of Nicaea. Until that time, both Christians and Jews generally observed the seventh-day Sabbath according to the biblical commandment. So slowly, in many ways, it became more difficult and even a capital offense to observe Sabbath, let alone Passover or the holy days. It became mandatory in many societies to treat Sunday as a day of rest and to attend the one, the only community church. And it was easy to know who did not show up each week. So there was tremendous pressure to observe Sunday. Previous to Bacchiocchi's thesis, based on the work of C.S. Mosna, it was the position of the Catholic Church that the Apostolic Church, that is, the early New Testament church as seen in the book of Acts, had eventually adopted Sunday, by which they threw off the Jewish Sabbath in favor of a day they associated with the Son, the resurrection. And this made it easier when Constantine later turned Sunday into a festival day, according to Mosna. Samuele Bacchiocchi defended his thesis on Friday, June 14th, 1974, in front of 5 Jesuit scholars. Later, his advisors said that the research was so compelling that it changed his mind about the cause of the adoption of Sunday. He graciously wrote the preface to the printed edition of the thesis, signed with his title, Chairman of the Church History Department. When the thesis was published, it was done so by the imprimatur of the university. Bacchiocchi was given a gold medal by the Pope for his scholarship. It would be difficult indeed for anything written by a non-Catholic to receive a stronger and more broad endorsement. And I just happen to have a copy of his thesis right here. And right there on this page, it's imprimatur, and it's published by the Pope Gregorian University Press. Now, Dr. Bacchiocchi published this, but the story he tells about how he secured the right to publish his own thesis is an interesting one in its own, because later, after Catholic scholars had time to absorb the thesis and understand its full implications, the advisor who approved it and sponsored him came under withering criticism that he was eventually forbidden any contact with Bacchiocchi, and the door was thus shut to admit any other non-Catholic to Pope Gregorian University. Happily, before this happened, Bacchiocchi had secured the copyright and thus the full rights to publish his own thesis. And you can buy it on Amazon, or you can download it, a free copy in PDF, from sites like Friends of the Sabbath, archive.org, or Z Library, or I can give you a copy. The title of the thesis of the book is From Sabbath to Sunday, a historical investigation of the rise of Sunday observance in early Christianity, published by the Pontifical Gregorian University Press, 1977. Today, such a high percentage of Christian organizations observe Sunday that any group not observing Sunday or observing the Sabbath is considered an outlier almost an illegitimate cult, except with the possible exception now of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, especially since they have recently accepted the doctrine of the Trinity. Organizations attempting to defend their practice of keeping Sunday either misrepresent Scripture or misrepresent church history. The evidence offered by Bacchiocchi comes from the archives of the Roman Church itself, the church that did the change. That organization officiated over and enforced the repudiation of the Sabbath, the adoption of Sunday as a replacement, but an empty one at that. It is now the position the church observes Sunday because it had the authority to do so, the authority to make the change. It's kind of a tautology. In fact, they use the authority over all Christians to observe Sunday. After all, the word Catholic does mean universal. Many people strongly object to the implications of this, but you can read the thesis for yourself and you can see the imprimatur with your own eyes. Lastly, the question of what day should be observed and how was important, even as recently as a few decades ago. The true gospel has been resisted in part because accepting it means accepting the Sabbath, that you should observe it. But as secular progressive culture increasingly prevails, it will soon start to act aggressively to oppose the true gospel on ideological grounds, not on theological grounds or historical grounds. The church as an organization, the Church of God, has come to be well practiced in advancing and defending the true gospel on scriptural grounds. I fear that they have not even started to devise ways to defend the true gospel against this new version of the same old enemy, the one that roars about loudly because he knows his time is growing very short.